Hello, my name is Kelly Morgan, and I'm with the Office of Research and Economic Development, specifically in the Office of Sponsored Programs here at the University of Idaho. This video is devoted to the topic of export controls. We will be looking at what types of projects and items are controlled under the federal government's import and export regulations, and how that relates to sponsored programs at a university. We will also be looking at how to determine if what you're working on is export controlled, and why knowledge of export control regulations is vital to grantsmanship, regardless of your specific area of expertise. And finally, we will be looking at the appropriate contacts and procedures in place at the University of Idaho should you find yourself in a situation where export controls will be a factor. As you can imagine, export controls are intensely detailed, with multiple rules and exceptions, multiple government offices, each with their own set of responsibilities and procedures, and varying degrees of severity for researchers and institutions that violate export control law. Fortunately for those engaged in sponsored activity at the University of Idaho, we employ several people who know and understand these regulations. Therefore, being a specialist in export controls is not necessary. I sat down with two of these individuals to get their perspective on export controls: Sunil Ramalingam, Contract Review Officer in the Office of Sponsored Programs, and Casey Inge, Associate General Counsel and Special Assistant to the Vice President for Research and Economic Development. But before we can discuss how to handle export-controlled material at the University of Idaho, it's helpful to get some perspective on why these regulations exist and how they've evolved since their inception. Although it's easy to assume that regulations governing what can and cannot cross U.S. borders are, for the most part, a post-9/11 phenomenon, U.S. export control regulations actually date back to before the nation was founded. One of the first acts of the First Continental Congress in December of 1774 criminalized the importing of goods from Great Britain. If we fast forward to 1940, we'll see the establishment of the Export Control Act. In an effort to keep the ever-spreading Second World War from expanding further, the U.S. intended to keep its military technology out of the hands of occupying nations. This act defined the three reasons why these controls needed to be in place then, and are still in place in a slightly different form now: for reasons of national security, in support of U.S. foreign policy, and for reasons of short supply of certain goods and materials. Economic embargoes, import and export status, and trade restrictions continue to be cornerstones of American foreign policy. So why is it necessary for specific principal investigators to comply with export control regulations at a national level? Well, the short answer is that the trend in sponsored activity is moving toward interdisciplinary, inter-university, and international collaboration. The potential for researchers to all of a sudden find themselves in an export-controlled situation will only increase as the University of Idaho moves toward more interdisciplinary, inter-university, and international projects. This is why a cursory knowledge of export control regulations and resources to navigate them is vital to grantsmanship at the University of Idaho. So what does it mean to export? Well, the traditional definition is to send or transport something abroad, especially for sale or trade. But in the arena of export control, the definition is much more broad. Under U.S. export control law, exporting can mean shipping or transporting a tangible commodity or item, but it can also mean the transfer of intangible items, data, technology, and other secure intangibles. Additionally, in order to be considered an export, export-controlled goods don't actually have to cross the U.S. border. Transfer of or access to export-controlled material to a foreign national, even within U.S. borders, also falls under the definition of exporting. Federal laws and regulations also prohibit the re-export or re-transfer of export-controlled material to a third-party nation or individual without appropriate licenses. So now that we know that any number of actions could be classified as exporting, the next step is knowing what is covered under export control regulations and how to handle export-controlled items at the University of Idaho. And for that, we'll enter into our conversation with Sunil Ramalingam and Casey Inge.
I'm Sunil Ramalingam. I'm the Contract Review Officer at Sponsored Programs and also the Export Control Analyst.
I'm Casey Inge. I'm Associate General Counsel for Research, and I advise the Research Office and coordinate with Sunil on export control.
Can you give a brief overview of what is and is not subject to export control regulations?
Anything controlled by the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or ITAR, which tends to be obvious defense items, or the Export Administration Regulations, or EAR, which are dual-use items.
And when we tend to talk about export control materials, we tend to speak in terms of military applications, civilian applications, but that can be a bit misleading. For example, the Export Administration regulations apply to crime control equipment, for example, batons, handcuffs. So that's just a quick shorthand that we use.
The research exclusion applies to basic and applied research in science and engineering, where the resulting information is ordinarily published and shared broadly within the scientific community. So if in the course of your research you expect to publish, which we do expect to happen, and there aren't any restrictions on the publication, then it should fit under the research exclusion.
So if someone were working on a project, what are some key words or phrases either in the request for proposals or in the contract that would trigger that this project is going to need to involve export control expertise?
Usually any limitations on publication results, so requirements that the sponsor approve publications, limitations on participation by non-U.S. citizens, foreign nationals.
Could you give a quick definition of U.S. person versus non-U.S. person?
U.S. persons aren't just U.S. citizens. They're also people who are asylees, people who are here on asylum, for instance, or if they have a green card, if they're legal permanent residents. Non-U.S. persons includes people who are here legally on visas, but visas such as an H-1B or a J-1. And because those are non-U.S. persons, then they may not be allowed to work with export control technologies. We may need a license before they're allowed to have any exposure at all to those technologies.
So what is kind of the normal course of action for someone who suspects or knows that they have a project where export controls are going to be a factor?
The university has developed an export control website that provides guidance on export control, as well as a decision tree. And the decision tree is very helpful in guiding individuals who have questions about technology or information that they're proposing to use, and helps them understand whether that's export controlled or not.
If it is clearly going to be an export controlled subject, if the technology is export controlled, then we would need to work with Dr. MacGyver's office, and the decision would have to be made whether or not we will be taking on the project.
They impose additional obligations and risk on the university and for the researcher, and we need to make sure we understand what those obligations and risks are before we accept the conditions that are imposed by these regulations.
What are the consequences for individuals and for the institution for violation of export control laws?
If the university discovers that there's been a violation and self-discloses to the government that a violation has been found, then I think that's where we would face the lightest consequences. It would also depend on the sort of violation. But where there's self-reporting, I think we would expect a fine. I guess I'd be concerned about any further consequences to research programs. In the worst case scenarios, I think the case that universities all over the country are looking at is the situation with Professor Roth from the University of Tennessee, who is a professor emeritus, who was indicted, tried, and at the age of, I believe, 72, was sentenced to 4 years in prison. And there's personal liability for a PI who violates export control regulations. There's institutional liability for the university. I think it's important that if there's any question, go to the website. If that doesn't answer your question, then contact the export control analyst. Because the consequences can be so drastic, I do think it's really important that before moving forward, people make sure that they're doing the right thing.
So in summary, looking to the contractual language or language in the request for proposals is the easiest way to see if you will be working with export-controlled material. If you don't find anything there, but still are unsure if your work could have potential military applications or could be classified as dual use, head to the Export Control website for clarification. From there, you may be directed to contact Sunil Ramalingam to figure out what steps to take to ensure that your project complies with federal import and export law. Failure to follow these steps can have devastating professional, personal, and institutional consequences, which is why the University of Idaho takes export controls so seriously. It's fortunate that we have individuals at the University of Idaho who are here to help navigate this arena. But as we've discussed, we have to know what we're looking for before we know if we need their assistance. The goal of the Office of Research and Economic Development is to protect principal investigators and the University of Idaho from potential missteps in export control legislation. The University of Idaho has a responsibility to protect you as researchers, but PIs also have a responsibility to protect the university by knowing and understanding, even at a cursory level, how export controls affect your sponsored work at the university. In closing, thank you for viewing this presentation. Please feel free to contact the Office of Sponsored Programs if you have any additional questions or concerns.